Hello and welcome to This Is How We Care, a podcast that examines what kind of world our children want to inherit and how we, the village raising them, can embody that world. I'm your host, Emily Race Newmark. Man, what a time it is to be a mother. And that is why I am releasing this episode for you today. Just for some little context, we are in the midst here in the United States of the Lindsay Clancy trial. And while this episode is not about Lindsay Clancy, this episode is not about even maternal mental health per se, I really wanted to expedite this conversation and get it out to you as soon as I could, because I felt like right now we're in a moment culturally, at least here in the States, where motherhood is kind of under the spotlight. The conversation that you're about to hear today is specifically looking at motherhood. And I do think this is an important conversation to listen to, whether you are a mother yourself or not, because the reality is we all are connected to motherhood in some way, right? Whether we personally have been initiated by motherhood or we've experienced motherhood through our mother's experience. My hope for you in listening to this episode today is that we can start to zoom out and see a bigger picture beyond just one individual experience, but through the lens of a cultural experience, how culture is actually shaping motherhood itself. And within this, my hope is that we can start to engage with ourselves, if we are mothers, or with mothers in the world a bit differently. If you're not a mother, I still feel like this is an extremely important episode to listen to because we all have been conditioned by the same cultural waters, regardless of whether we personally are a mother or not. So unlearning and relearning and getting curious and hearing what our guest, Dr. Sophie Brock, has to say today, I believe is a really integral piece as a collective as we begin to imagine a different world, a world rooted in collective care, a way forward for our society. A bit about our guest, Dr. Sophie Brock. Sophie is a motherhood studies sociologist and mother who offers education and training on the sociology of motherhood and how society shapes mothers' experiences, covering topics and concepts such as the perfect mother myth, which we'll go into depth today, the care-career conundrum, the anger-guilt trap, and more. Sophie's work aims to change the cultural construction of motherhood, to create a world where mothers feel empowered, supported, and valued. Sophie hosts the Good Enough Mother podcast. She provides mentoring to mother-supporting practitioners and business owners, and she runs a professional development online training called the Motherhood Studies Certification. And I myself have been personally going through this certification, and I highly recommend you check that out if you find yourself working in any aspect with mothers and want to go deeper into some of the concepts that we talk about today. Okay, with that, let's get into the conversation with Sophie. I am so excited and honored to be sitting here with Sophie, Dr. Sophie Brock, and to just be getting into a conversation around motherhood that I think is way more nuanced than we actually consider in our day-to-day. And hopefully this will open up something for folks, whether you are a mother or not. I think there's ways that this conversation really impacts all of us. So excited to be here with you today, Sophie.
Thanks so much for having me, Emily.
I love starting with a little bit of story time. And, I'm sure there's many stories of how you kind of got into the work that you're doing now. But what is your story of how you got into motherhood studies work?
Yeah, well, I think for a lot of us, we are drawn to the space because of our own experience in becoming mothers. But that was actually a little bit different for me. So I completed my PhD in motherhood studies, sociology, specifically before I became a mum. And I always found that very curious to hear people's reactions and responses, because when I was doing my research, when I would share what I was focusing on, people would then presume that I was a mum and ask me about that. And when I would say, actually, I'm not, most people would be really surprised by that. And they'd say, oh, but you're not a mum? Like, what makes you interested in this then? And for me as a social scientist, that is a really curious response because it tells us something about how and why people are focused on mothers and motherhood. There's a presumption that, well, this is only interesting enough because it relates to your own lived experience. And there are many areas of research and areas of scholarship that academics are engaged in that don't necessarily have to relate to the lived experience. But at the same time, I also find it curious that we can perceive motherhood to be this niche sort of topic or subject area, because far as I'm concerned, it is one of the most universal subjects there is. We've all been mothered in some way. We're all born from a mother, right? We know mothers, we work with mothers. So even if we're not a mother ourselves, we are shaped by the culture of motherhood and by mothers' experiences. And so I initially got into this work actually because I found a footnote in an essay that I was writing, and it was by Professor Andrea O'Reilly, and it referenced motherhood studies. And I was in the third year of my bachelor's degree, and I specialized in, majored in sociology. And I had never heard of this motherhood studies field. And I thought, what is that? I've always had an interest and curiosity in women's inner lives. And so that kind of just led me down this track of exploring it more fully and discovering it was an area that really needed more attention than it already had.
I do remember you sharing that story, and I just want to add to like my own experience. It's kind of parallel to that. Is I remember when I was pregnant with my first and like was really going through that identity process of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to become a mother. There was like a very deep-seated fear that I was going to become invisible and that I was going to be like grouped with the mother group. And in that was really like, I'll just kind of be forgotten about. I'm sure in your work, you kind of break apart these different reasons for that thinking. But yeah, it's really interesting, right? Just that slight paradigm shift that you're making that maybe we've been conditioned to think that like, oh, mothers, that you only care about mothers if you are a mother. But in reality, like we all come from one. So I'd love to direct us to like the vision that you hold around like how we might actually relate to that identity and the role of the mother in society. Like what's your vision for what could be there?
Yeah, well, I'll respond to the first part of your question initially, because I think part of what you've described is really common in that fear of invisibility, and that reflects what we've been socialized into and our broader social structure, which is that care work is devalued. So when you go into a role that is oriented around care work, particularly one that's unpaid, like mothering would be counted as this, right? It is seen as being less valuable. It is seen as not contributing. It is seen as being actually a way for us to lose our sense of self and identity, because we have this throwaway line, and I know that this is common in parts of the world outside of my context in Australia, but it's pretty common here to hear a phrase of, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm just a mum.
Yeah.
And so there's this sense that when you become a mother, and we can talk more about this, I'm sure, Emily, that when you become a mother, you are entering into a new social role, and that social role comes with certain assumptions and stereotypes of what it means to be a good mum. Mm-hmm. And to be a good mum means losing yourself. To be a good mum means giving up your identity. But to be a good mum also means you're going to be trapped because you can't actually do it right either way. And so this tentativeness or fear or concern that we may have when going into motherhood or making a decision to become mothers or thinking about that, it makes total sense to have that sense of trepidation, ambivalence, or confusion or uncertainty, because we are well aware of the cultural stories we've been told, because they start being told to us way before we become mothers ourselves.
I mean, and that even points to like what's inherited from our own mothers. And I think even on like an unspoken level, like what they carry in their bodies, from generation to generation around what their role means. What have you noticed with that, the intergenerational inheritance around this story?
Yeah, I think that there's lots of ways to answer that. And the first thought that I had actually was, thinking about what neuroscientists would say about this in terms of epigenetics, and even looking at the, this isn't my area of specialty, but looking at the ways in which epigenetically there are certain stories and expressions that are passed down generationally. And there's always this interplay between culture, society, structure, and like genetics. Like it's that whole thing too of kind of nature versus nurture. And what I'm curious about as a sociologist is looking at the way that social conditions have shaped choice and decision making and desire. How were we brought up to think about ourselves, to think about the possibilities that are available to us in our lives. If I think back to my dad's mum, she had 6 children, and when she had her first child, she had to leave her job. You couldn't work and be a mother. She didn't have her own bank account. She wasn't able to drive, right? So I think about the context that she was living in, and the possibilities and choices that were open to her were completely different to the context I'm living within. As my grandmother on my mum's side, she became a mother very young. There weren't social policies or welfare in place to be able to support her if she chose to have the baby on her own, right? So like marriage was something which was presumed and actually part of an important step in securing economic and financial security. So all of the times that we're talking about decision, choice, what do we want for ourselves and our lives, it's always shaped by, yes, the stories in our family lineage, but also the social conditions that we're currently facing and the cultural narratives about what it means to be a woman, a mother, to be a successful person in our current context. And I think that's why many of us as mothers are really struggling and grappling with these types of questions, which are ultimately to do with identity.
Okay, so do you have like a general characterization around like the current generation of mothers that are raising children under 10 years old? Like, what are some of the characteristics of that generation and socialization that's happening for us, particularly, that you're noticing?
Yeah, I think always contextualizing who we're talking about if I'm going to talk about current like trends, because mothering is culturally dependent and different cultures there are different answers to this question. So I'm really responding from my context in like a Western setting and environment, one that has been largely shaped by individualization. So this idea that it is through individual hard work that we succeed. So it's like merit-based, it's performance-based, it's connected in with capitalism. Right, because the way our economy is structured, we think about value as equating with productivity. We think about value and productivity as being connected to economics, money. We are in environments where, because of how our social structure is set up, that does lead to either constraint of choice or greater freedom of choice in terms of how we have access to capital. So individualization, these are big kind of sociological concepts that I'm pointing to, but they're connected. So individualization is one, and that can be really difficult for us as mothers, particularly for mothers who have built careers before they become mothers, because they are heavily embedded within a particular system and way of thinking that does not translate well to the experience of mothering. And maybe we can talk more about that. But the other big things that will be shaping of the current context mothers are finding themselves in at least a kind of westernized environment is technological expansion and globalization. So we're mothering in an environment that has never existed before in this way. We are connected more than ever through global networks, through these little mini computers we have in our hands. And that in many ways can lead to really positive, helpful things. And it's always a nuanced answer, right? But also a lot of disconnection and comparison and toxicity as well. And so I think we're in an age where there is intensive pressure on mothers. There is an overload of information and we can get lost in the sea of that. And there is an erosion of community and connection that I think so many mothers are craving. And we add all of that into the context that many mothers are finding themselves in, which looks like political instability, which looks like fear, which looks like worry about the safety of themselves, their children, their families. And so it's an extremely stressful, heightened context for mothers to be mothering in and to be raising their children within at the moment, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, thank you for naming that, because it definitely, I think what that softens for me is like an acknowledgement of like, wow, there's these things bigger than myself, right? That like bigger than my individual experience that are contributing to my experience of motherhood, which I know is like really what your work is about, is kind of distilling these different nuances, these different layers. So I definitely want to spend time going into some of the definitions and the ways that you look at things. But first, let's bring us back to my question earlier. My question around your vision vision? Because I would love to ground us first in that place of like, what are you really hoping to see as possible? How would we relate to mothers and mothering? What's your vision there?
Mm. I always hold vision really lightly, because what I mean by that is that sometimes if we hold it too strongly or too closely, we can miss the opportunity to be adaptive based on changing context. We can overlook things sometimes. We can sometimes have tunnel vision, and sometimes we can yearn to create something that we've envisioned that ends up becoming another kind of cage or trap for us. And so that's my kind of pre-answer to this question. But I think that in a really core way, my vision is for mothers to be empowered, to take their power back, to recognize the power they already hold, for motherhood to be valued in our culture and society, for mothers to be structurally supported institutionally, economically, socially, for us to be able to hold our sense of self and identity separate to the role of mother. I think that it can become a problem when the word mother is equated with woman, and that's what has happened. And so this, I think, part of our liberation needs to look like freedom of choice to not become mothers, freedom and capacity to define ourselves both inside our mothering experience and see real value in that, and also outside of our experience as mothers, to look at ourselves as people who are multifaceted, who are whole, who are nuanced, who are complex, and to really resist the ways in which we are boxed in society and culture. I think that that's something that can be a kind of identity-based problem for lots of people in society, not just mothers. But I think particularly when we enter this role of mother, it's one that is so intimate and so personal and so unique in the relationship we have with not just our children, but each child, if you have multiple children, that is also so heavily impacted and flavored by the cultural context that we're sitting within. And so my hope is that through my work, I'm able to talk about the differences between that relationship and the role that we have as mothers and the way that we are shaped by this broader context of motherhood. And hopefully through having more understanding of that relationship, we have more agency and autonomy in our own individual lives to make shifts and changes where we're able to, and also knowing where our limits exist as well.
Yeah, it's really, I really thank you for exploring the vision at your disclaimer at the start, because I think what that opens up, and you just naming these things, right, is like almost a contrast to what I often hear as like a prevalent narrative about how trapped women feel in motherhood, right? Or just like the limited definition that we do find ourselves in within motherhood. So as you're kind of just describing like having a sense of autonomy and liberation and seeing ourselves as more than just that identity, and seeing pathways for ourselves beyond just motherhood being like the only path available to be successful as a woman. Hearing you name that, really, I felt it in my body be like, whoa, I didn't even realize I was tight there. Like I didn't even realize there was some constrictions. And I want to also get your thoughts on this. A lot of my work is focused on this idea of revillaging and bringing community back into the center focus. And I have talked to other women who are not mothers yet about that, you can actually play a really important role in a village context as an auntie. And that gives you, direct relationship to young people, and like you can play that mothering role. But like, I think there's a conversation to be had about how that too, there's like been a diminishing of the importance of that. Have you seen that in your work at all, or have thoughts on that auntie identity?
I have a couple of responses to that. One being that I think it's important to be conscious of gendered socialization and this sense that it starts with good girl conditioning of the ways that we are trained to orient outside of ourselves as girls and as women, to think about and anticipate the needs of others. And I think that that is and can be a problem and a strength. So I am always very conscious of how this dynamic can play out, and knowing that it's ultimately actually not women's responsibility to have to take care of everyone and everything. And so sometimes that can sound contrary to the vision that we want to try and create and weave, particularly as mothers who are feeling isolated in terms of village and community, and looking at ourselves as social beings and actually resisting that individualization thesis, right? So I'm kind of naming two different things here. One is to name and notice social stories that exist that tell us how we ought to be in looking after everyone else and resisting that. And then on the other hand, looking at the way that we function as human beings in relationship and in community, and the ways that our current setup, and again, when I say our, I'm talking about kind of a pretty narrow westernized context, but we are set up for disconnection. We should not be in a space where there are women who are becoming mothers and the first time they've held a baby is their own.
Right.
That's a problem, right? It's a problem if we have not seen breastfeeding happen around us, and that the first time we've seen a 2-year-old breastfeed is our own 2-year-old breastfeeding, right? We're meant to mother in relationship, and it's a practice that is learnt, and that is a skill that is honed, and it's honed in relationship. And we need witnessing, we need modeling. And I've had an interesting experience of this in my own life because I'm very close with my sister, and she lived with me for the first couple of years of my daughter's life. And so I hadn't experienced this up close example of, well, what does an actual real life baby behave like? Like how do they actually act? And I kind of went into it going, oh, well, everyone says newborns don't sleep at all. And so I know that, but then sleep gradually gets better, right? Well, no. And when my sister has had the experience of living with a newborn who turns into an 8-month-old, who turns into a 14-month-old, she has a very up close and realistic understanding of the way that infant sleep is not linear. And so how has that then shaped her experience when she's become a mother? Because she already has had some of that insight. And I think that that's a lot of what we are missing in terms of connection and community, and this space of the auntie, as you describe it, but also eldership. Who are we able to turn to for holding space? And this is kind of coming back to the theme that you raised earlier of the intergenerational impacts of the social construction of motherhood and how it has come to shape each generation and the flow-on effects of that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It really hits here when I'm pointing to my chest. Like when you describe the fact that we shouldn't have our first experience of mothering be when we actually are becoming a mother, if that's the path that we go down, right? And I named the aunties because we are speaking in this moment to women. However, I think there is also a case and a conversation to be made for like male figures and uncles, or however you identify, right? Like what is your role in that community? So just to clarify, when you're talking about like the gendered aspects of caregiving, would you say that your vision then holds that caregiving is something that is held by like all genders and generations, and not just confined to the socialized identity for women? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. And I would add a caveat onto that to say that we also, and I know not everyone agrees with me on this, but I would also say we need to protect the mother-baby dyad as well. So I think that we need to make sure that we can do both and we can hold both, but it's difficult to hold complexity in social and cultural commentary and narratives because we like things to be binary and often polarizing because that generally attracts more attention. But I think that we absolutely need to widen the net on what care means, what care can look like, caregiving as a practice that is valued and valuable. And also, I think that there is we need to hold in mind, particularly around the early stages of mothering, that when somebody goes through the experience of pregnancy and birth, especially, and that early postpartum, there are particular embodied aspects of that experience that I think need to be protected and honored and cared for.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's actually through that realization myself, stepping into motherhood, being like, wow, the mother-baby dyad is one, a thing I didn't know about, two, something to really like protect and honor. But then that it actually brought up for me a lot of anxiety of how am I possibly going to be like, how can I do that without burning myself out was essentially like the boiled down version, because I was coming from a context of individualism and, a lot of these ideas that you're naming. So yeah, I think for me, my personal vision around community is really about that. It's like, how can we honor mother baby dyad, but also honor that the mother needs to be cared for in order to hold that role. I see you nodding. Do you have anything to add to that caveat?
Yeah, definitely. I would say remembering that we're interdependent creatures as humans and we are all vulnerable. We were all infants, and many of us, most of us, will have a period in our lives where we need to be cared for. And so it's part of kind of our social contract to engage in that care. But what makes it tricky in this context where so many people are experiencing burnout, people are struggling with how they manage their time. We have the erosion of particular institutions, which in some ways has been good, but in some ways has left a gap for where people can kind of gather and feel connected with each other. And so community building and relationship building requires effort, requires time, it requires energy, it requires investment, it requires vulnerability. And so all of that is a big ask when we are already managing so many other things. But I think having conversations like this can be useful for us to open up to the possibility of how can I connect in here, or open myself to the possibility of connecting, because sometimes that's the scariest thing in even naming something that we want or facing a gap that we may feel in our life and looking at where can we take agency for trying to respond to that and to meet that. But I think that this is a problem that kind of goes beyond just for mothers themselves and is something that many of us are experiencing in kind of modern day society.
Absolutely. Yeah. I kind of describe it as like my way into acknowledging our interdependence and our need for community was through motherhood, but that is not the only identity, the only archetype within the village that needs this lens. One thing I wanted to get into with you was really this idea of the fish tank model. And within that, there's kind of these like three distinctions to be made around motherhood, mothering, mother, I guess. Can you name those three and kind of walk us through that?
Sure. Yeah. So this model really it came as a result of a theoretical finding in my PhD research, and it rests on maternal scholarship and theorists that have been doing this work for decades. Adrienne Rich wrote a book called Of Woman Born in 1976, and she named in there the institution of motherhood as distinct from the experience of being a mother. And then there was another key text, and this is by Professor Sarah Ruddick, and she came up with this idea of maternal thinking and mothering as a practice. And so I'm just kind of naming the theoretical foundations that this model draws from. And the idea is I love an analogy and I'm quite visual. And so I developed this kind of by accident when explaining it to a group of mothers years ago, and I've just kind of run with it as a model. And what we can do is we can envision and imagine this round glass fish tank or a fish bowl, right? And that tank is society, structure, and that's what we're calling motherhood. Now, I think about this in my mind as like the hood as like capitalized, like motherhood. This is the environment that we're living within. And then we have the water inside the tank. That's our culture. So that is what, as fish, as the people, the mothers within the tank, that's what we're swimming around in. That's what we're absorbing. And often we don't know necessarily that we're in it explicitly until it's pointed out to us. It's something that we're absorbing, that we're moving through, and we've been born into it from the beginning. And it looks clear, but it's not. It's flavored in a particular way. And so if we look at this, we've got this tank, we've got the water inside, we've got the fish swimming around. Those are us as mothers, and actually everyone in society are in the tank. But what is written on the tank are a bunch of rules and expectations about what it means to be a good mum. And so if we imagine like a big black texter and we write on there, and if we're all in a room together, I would be saying, what are some things that you think makes a good mum? And we would be able to pull out a bunch of things like, well, she always puts her kids first. But in this day and age, she's not just a mum. She has a flourishing career, but she never puts work before her kids. But she also has a certain number of kids and she's a certain age and she looks a particular way. So she doesn't have only one because that would be selfish or depriving her one child of a sibling. But then she doesn't have too many because why would you have 5 children? What are you thinking? She becomes a mother at a particular age range. So she's not too young because that would be irresponsible. But then she's not too old and is the geriatric mother who focused on all these other things in her life and didn't put her fertility as a priority. So she's within a particular age range. She looks a particular way. So the mothers that we have on the pedestal of what it means to be the perfect mum, she's set up as being white and middle class, able-bodied. She has children who are also able-bodied, who don't have disabilities, right? They are positioned economically in a very specific, particular way. She is assumed to be heterosexual. She's assumed to be married or in a long-term monogamous relationship. She is expected to be both financially dependent and financially independent. And so we're like trapped with that. We're trapped with how she gives birth, right? Because there are particular expectations on what it means to have a good birth or a bad birth, on whether you breastfeed or you don't breastfeed, whether you sleep train or you don't sleep train, how good of a baby you have. Do they sleep through the night? Do they not? What are you doing as a mother? Because she has powerless responsibility. So this is a term that came from Adrienne Rich in her book Of Woman Born. And what it means is that we have all of the responsibility, but we don't have the social capital and power to draw on to actually enact what it is we're expected to do. And this is why so much mother blame exists, right? It is why when you go, speaking from personal experience here, when I go to pick up my 3-year-old from preschool, and she has, done something she shouldn't have. She's pushed another child or she's, pulled someone's hair or she's upended her food or whatever. I have to fill out an incident report and I feel this wave of guilt and shame and not good enough because her behavior is a reflection on me, right? I'm the one who's shaping it. I'm the one who has responsibility for it. And so that's just a micro example of how this plays out in a variety of ways. And what I'm talking about here is the perfect mother myth. And the way that it's set up means that mothers are trapped either way. There is no way to hack this. There is no way to get it right. There is no way to meet the markers and the ideals. All of us will fall outside of it in some way. And that's why mum guilt is so prevalent. And so when you said earlier in this conversation that so many mothers say they feel, I think you said they feel trapped by motherhood. Like we are trapped by motherhood. That's the structure. We are. What we can do inside the structure is say, well, let me name it and let me explore how it is impacting me and my agency. And to run with this analogy further, the fish inside are swimming in the water. Some of us face more barriers and obstacles than others. So I think about this as like seaweed in the tank or obstacles. If you are a lesbian mother, you'll face more barriers. If you're a Black mother, you'll face more barriers. Your socioeconomic and cultural position will impact how much access you have to resources. What's important to say here, though, is that many times the thing that marginalizes us or that creates us as being an outsider status oftentimes is the very thing that mothers draw on to take back their power.
Yeah. Can you say more? I've heard you say this before, and I want to go down that rabbit hole a little bit more with you. What does that look like in practice as an example?
So there's been some research done on teenage mothers, and they found that looking at the way that mothers who become mothers, say when they're 18 years old and they go along to, in Australia, we have council-run mothers groups in some spaces, and they go along and all of the other mothers there are in their 30s and they're in partnerships. And this 18-year-old may be having this baby on her own, right? And so she's noticed already a difference in life stage, in language, in shared experience. And on some level has identified that she's an outsider in some way to this narrative that is forming of what motherhood is going to look like. And so to some extent, that actually creates an open space for her to start writing her own story about what she wants her motherhood to look like. This happened for me in my own life. I'm a single mum. I didn't expect to be a single mum, and I became one shortly after my daughter was born. And so I had the opportunity, I would not have framed it as that at the time, but in hindsight, I had the opportunity to pull down everything that I had been told, everything that I had fantasized about of what my life would be like, and rewrite a vision for what things could be. That always involves a process of grief. That always involves a process of feeling like you're an outsider, of feeling like you no longer belong because you don't. But it also gives you the opportunity to say, what is it that I want here, right? And some of us, what's coming up for me is thinking about this as a writer of like a lot of the time, the blank page is the most daunting space to embark on. And we're not blank pages. We're shaped by context, but part of what we're doing and part of what mothers have been doing for a very, very, very long time, as long as they've been mothering, is finding ways to resist. And for some mothers, particularly I'm thinking about Danny McLean has written a book called, I think it's called We Live for the We, The Power of Black Motherhood. And for some mothers, that is not a choice. They're having to find ways to resist structure for the survival of themselves and their children. And so our entry points to this will be different based on where we're positioned in our society and culture and what barriers and whether we're all facing sexism, whether we're facing racism, different forms of misogyny. It will shift what modes of resistance we draw on. But that is our pathway through. We're creating cracks in the tank. So I think of the little fish and they're like ramming into the side of the tank. And what is useful to also hold in mind, coming back to your point about community, is that we're not meant to do that alone. The more of us we can like swim in like a school of fish, right? And we all like target a particular section of the tank and it can change. What the tank looked like for my grandmother, for my great-grandmother, it's different. It changes according to historical location and geographical and contextual location too. So that's the hope piece that I want us to be able to hold in mind too.
Yeah, I mean, wow, there's so much I want to underline, but just to really like emphasize this point that I'm hearing, which is like, okay, yes, there's an experience. If one has an experience of being an outsider, it's an outsider actually from the socialization and the institution of motherhood that actually isn't serving us as a whole. And so in that, like, that's the access point to creating a new story, a new lens. And then I would add, or I have a curiosity around like, how do we actually support each other in that? Because so much of what I have found with this good, bad mother binary and like the way that we've actually been socialized to police each other or like judge each other for like, oh, she's a bad mom, or, and when I look at it from a community lens, I just want to add too, like that's not serving us communally because we're really like siphoning like the connections that we can have and the way that we could be working together. But then on the larger like social change level, what I'm hearing from you is like we actually need to be like acting as agents together to shift this narrative. So what is that work look like for us to one, shift the good, bad mother, the perfect mother myth narrative, like for ourselves, but also together?
Yes. So part of how socialization operates and part of why it's effective and part of why the tank still exists in the way that it does is because we're complicit in our own regulation. So it wouldn't continue to function if we all found our pathways to resist it. And that's what we've just been talking about, right? Is finding different pathways to resist it. And you're bringing in this piece of, well, what does that look like in relationship with others? What does that look like in community? I think it almost always has to start on an individual level in looking at our own socialization and exploring the way that we've internalized these messages of good and bad. And a place for us to start that's accessible in doing that is to just write out like a sentence on a page. And you can start with something like, a good mother should be, or good mums only, or good mums don't. And you can also try a thought experiment where you imagine that like an alien has just landed on Earth and they pull you up and they say to you, can you paint me a picture of what your society thinks a good mum is? And so we're not asking about your values here. We're not saying what's important to you as a mum. We're saying, what's the picture that you've been sold and that you recognize about what it means to be a good mum? And the tricky thing is that if we write out a list and we write out all those things like self-sacrificing and always puts her children first, and, she has a clean home and she organizes activities regularly, or, we can come up with 100 things. Some of the things on that list will be part of your values. And it'll look different to another mother. So if I'm talking to a nutritionist who has a 2-year-old and an 8-year-old, and we're unpacking the perfect mother myth and what that looks like for her, and we get to a topic of like nutrition and health and well-being, the way that she may value that in her life and the importance that she places on that for her and her family might look different to me, another mother who's not a nutritionist. But the guilt surrounding what we feed our children can sound the same, but it's coming from different places, and both have these layers of social conditioning on top of it. So what we're really doing when we're writing out this list is we're wanting to identify what do we know to be true in our culture of the pressures that exist on mums. Then we want to go through each one and kind of ask ourselves, how much have I internalized that? How much is that impacting me in my everyday life? Is this something that I don't actually care that much about and am happy to let go? Like if my daughter has like nuggets, twice a week, don't actually care. Okay. But is it something we want to let go, or is it something that's important to us? And also importantly, what do we get to be indecisive about? Like I always say, we have the ticks and the crosses and the circles of going, I need to find out more information about that. I need to think a bit more about that. I might change my mind about that. And so I'm steering away a little bit from where you've originally led us. But I think part of what we do when thinking about how to break this good, bad mother binary is to know that it needs to be broken within us first. Because if it hasn't, we will continue to judge and monitor other mothers' behaviors, because that's part of how surveillance works.
I just wanted to add to that because I can speak from my direct experience of doing some of that internal work that you're naming. And like, I think what you're pointing to is like you actually experience this like liberation within yourself of like, oh, actually, I don't have to hold myself to this impossible standard, and I can actually acknowledge what is important to me and what I can like loosen a grip on. And that experience is something that I then want others to have. And so I think from that place, it's like, oh, wow, why would I judge a friend for doing mothering different than me? If I want her to also feel like the freedom to choose the way that makes sense for her. So it's like embodying that experience, then it makes you want to share it with others, was my experience.
Yeah. And often, look, not always, but often the judgment that we project on others is a form of judgment and discomfort that we are sitting with within ourselves, right? And so this works the other way as well, in that the more congruent we can get in our own values and our own desires and our own experience of mothering, the less shaken we are when we do receive that judgment for others, because it doesn't have the place to stick as much, right? And if it does, that is often an indication of something else that may be present there for us. An example of this, from my own experience, and this judgment came from my daughter, so it was quite potent of an example. But she said something along the lines of, she was frustrated that I think that I'd brought my laptop to her gymnastics lesson. And so I sit there in her gymnastics lesson, and I usually watch her, but this particular occasion I brought my laptop along, and I told her that I would. And then afterwards she was annoyed that I wasn't watching her the whole time. And because she's 8, she is playing around with language and agency and identity a lot. And the you never and I will never and I'm moving out and, and then there's you're the best mum ever and you're the worst mum ever. Like we've got the extremes happening.
Right.
And part of what she expressed to me was that, you never watch me at gymnastics. You're just looking at your laptop. And she was trying to rile me up. She does successfully sometimes. But she was poking me around this kind of relationship that I have with my work and protesting about the fact that she wanted all of my attention. And, this will shift depending on our children's personalities and temperaments too. But it is very easy to allow yourself to become completely consumed by motherhood and by our children. And to some degree, we do and we are, and sometimes that's functional. But there comes points in our child's development, especially around toddlerhood, is when it initially often first starts, where there is a level of necessity to letting them down, to disappointing them. This is important psychological experience for them. But we will not be comfortable in doing that if we are beholden to the perfect mother myth that tells us we should never disappoint our children and that it is our responsibility to make them happy. And so in this example, if I was judging myself and I was uncomfortable about my relationship with work, then those comments from her could have devastated me and sent me into a spiral of mum guilt. But because I'm confident and I'm anchored in my relationship to work, because I know the depth of our relationship and I'm comfortable with the level of attention that I'm able to offer her and do offer her, I'm able to hold steady. And what that does is it benefits obviously me as a mother in that I haven't just gone down a whole guilt thing of, I feel I'm the worst mom, oh, I need to never bring my laptop again to gymnastics. But it actually also helps our children because they need sturdiness, they need an anchor, they need leadership. And we're not able to offer them that effectively if we are spiraling in places of guilt and shame that the perfect mother myth sets us up for. Again, I've moved away. I haven't answered your surveillance question, Emily.
Oh, definitely. We'll get there. But no, I really appreciate that example because, I think, it's really bringing up my own experience of that, of like every night before I go to bed, running the tape on how was I not a good enough mother today, and thinking about all the ways of how am I the one that is going to mess up my child. But I think I have to come back to, and maybe this is what you're saying too, it's like it is actually part of our role as parents that we will not be perfect. Like, I don't know, like that is part of the relationship, and that you can't in the same way that we can never really obtain the perfect mother identity, we can never really obtain like perfection for their childhood.
It would be a problem if we did. Yeah, it would be a problem if we did. And so the thing is that, and there's lots of research on this. And part of what we're highlighting here too is that it is a relationship. It's not a project. Like, we are not here to write on the blank slate of who our child is and who they're becoming. Like, they are their own person. They have their own agency. They have their own autonomy. We've been gifted the privilege and responsibility of guiding them. But that means also showing them what being a real human looks like, obviously in age-appropriate ways. And this shifts according to their development and ours. But they need to see what it looks like for us to mess up. They need to see what it looks like and feels like to get a repair from us, for us to be humble enough to say, hey, I got that wrong. Here's what I'm going to do differently. Here's how I'm managing it. Here's something that I'm struggling with. Again, like age appropriate ways. But our job is not to model perfection for them. And if it is, then we're setting them up for a cage that they'll end up struggling to break free from as well. So we're not doing them any favors in thinking that we're going to get this right. We're not. And it's important that we don't. We don't need to actively try and mess up. It will naturally happen. Yeah. But when we think back on our day and we think, and we may ask ourselves that question of like, how was I not a good enough mother today? Like, that really, it's a trapping question to ask ourselves, right? And it asks us to place our attention and focus on all of the deficits. And again, that's what we've been oriented to do as women, to be very self-critical and to look at all of the ways that we're falling short. And so I hope that through introducing some of these concepts and language and insights that we're able to shift the questioning of that a little bit and think about what are the ways that, how did I show up? How did I show up today? What did I learn from today? What gift did my children receive from seeing me in that way today? If there's something that feels out of alignment, which guilt is a really useful marker of, sometimes it's guilt because we have acted outside of our values. A lot of the time, though, it's guilt because we're not meeting the perfect mother myth. But sometimes it's when we have acted outside of our values. And so let's use that as something to help shift our behavior rather than something to ruminate in, because that just spirals us in further. And I have a model, which you would know, Emily, from the certification, called the anger guilt trap model. And part of that self-questioning and this guilt is what it sets us up to do. And it leads us to more resentment, having fewer boundaries, feeling more depleted, facing a trigger, which our children will bring us regularly. And that trigger, our, children, partners, like society, like we will get the triggers everywhere. And usually it's something small, and that will just tip us over the edge. It's like we're holding on to the edge of the cliff and we can't anymore. And then we feel bad and guilty, and that sends us around this spiral again. So I think, the conversation we're having can be a really important meeting place to be able to really quite radically shift our experience of what it means to be a mum.
Yeah, thank you. But that's what I was going to ask next is like, what is the reframe? So you offered some beautiful questions that we could maybe sit with at the end of our days instead. And again, this inner work of defining like what we've internalized around the perfect mother myth. But let's go to, this surveillance of mothering idea, because I think it's really key here. So yeah, what is that and how is that showing up for us right now?
Yeah. So a model that I teach practitioners draws on a theory, and without going into like all of the details, it comes from Jeremy Bentham, who designed basically this prison design, and then Foucault kind of theorized this in terms of power. So the idea is if we imagine this kind of circle, and then there's a circle inside of the circle, right? And the outer circle represents the prison. Like you imagine all these little like people in cells around the perimeter. And then the inside is the guard tower. And so that is the idea of this circular design. It means that regardless of where you are in the prison, you always feel like you're being watched because that guard tower is in the middle. And using this as an analogy to talk about surveillance, what that guard tower is, the structure of motherhood. Those are all of the shoulds. Those are all of the expectations. There's all the judgments, the little comments you get from strangers. Like that is the institution of motherhood. It's where it's held in the center, and it is all around us and inside of us. That's because of socialization. So it's in our own heads as well. And so how this functions means that regardless of if you are out in public dealing with a tantrum, or you're inside the four walls of your own home and it's just you and your child, you feel a level of surveillance. Surveillance comes from the outer and surveillance comes from the inner. Self-surveillance is what we do to police ourselves, to judge ourselves in, are we meeting the marker of the perfect mother myth? Like that question of what are the ways I wasn't good enough today? Like that can be interpreted as a form of self-surveillance. You're self-policing. And so how this functions means that when we are socialized into this, and when I keep saying socialized, I'm wanting to emphasize that I'm not saying that this is a choice that mothers are doing. I'm not saying that, oh, we're struggling because we just do it to ourselves, right? It's a process that happens outside of us. And so to emphasize that, and obviously, this is a big topic I'm trying to condense succinctly, but part of how it functions is that we not only judge ourselves, but we also have to judge and police other mothers. So in this guard tower experiment prison design, not only do the inmates feel like they've got to regulate themselves, but if they see another inmate who is stepping out of line, who is doing something different, who is breaking the rules, there can be an inclination or a tendency to want to pull them back into line. And so that is how social policing works, especially in the space of motherhood. It's why like the sort of narratives around mummy wars or judgment can sometimes come up. But the place that we can start to break free from that and to subvert a little bit of this is to know, A, that the guard tower in the middle like exists. Like this is a thing. This is a dynamic. It's been studied. There's whole areas of, research, and this is a thing. It's not just you. We have gone through this process. It's been a powerful process of socialization, and we can't jump out of that tank. We continue to live in it, but we can become more practiced and attuned to hearing and knowing and picking up when we're being regulated or when we're trying to self-police ourselves. And that's a practice that takes time. But on the other side of it, we never really get on the other side of it, but further along the line, we find so much more freedom and agency and choice and relief and less guilt and a freer experience of what it means to be a mother when we're aware of these dynamics and when we break down that good-bad dichotomy. Because all of the bad that we identify in another, it touches us or is within us somewhere, or
Mhm.
we're scared of it in some way, right? All of the good that we idealize is in some way part of our own fantasy and desire. And so this good mother, bad mother binary, the good rests on the bad. We don't know who the perfect mother is unless we can talk about the bad one. And so whenever we're in situations, either socially, if you're, watching, like plays out through film, television, pop culture, media, politics, always it can be helpful to attune and orient to absolutes, to binaries, to good, bad, to black and white, and to just allow ourselves a little bit of a space for pause there in getting curious about how that might be functioning and how we might want to question that, challenge it, have some curiosity about, why am I asking myself this question about where I failed today? And it's that little opening of curiosity that can be our kind of pathway through to this work in a deeper way.
You know, thank you for going into that. And I think just on the public piece, when you're out in the world and that surveillance is happening more publicly, I think one thing I've experienced for myself is like I actually have caught myself performing a certain version of motherhood at times. And like this performance, like would you just kind of chalk it up to, and that is trying to become the perfect mother in the eyes of society? Or like, is there more going on there that you want to uncover for us?
Yeah, in my PhD research, I spoke to mothers who have children with disabilities. And there was one of my participants, and her child was nonverbal, had some genetic abnormalities, and basically it meant that he wasn't able to respond to her. So she described this experience to me of being out in the shopping centre with her son in the trolley, and he is very vocal and very kind of noisy, making all sorts of different noises and sounds, and that attracts attention. And so she said that she will be going along in the shopping centre and, let's just say his name's Lachlan. And she'll say, "Oh, Lachlan, you're being so noisy. Oh, Lachlan, I'll settle down." Knowing full well it would make zero difference. He was not going to settle. That was all performative. And she was conscious and aware of the fact that she was doing that to manage her self-perception in public. Now, it's very easy for us to sit here from a standpoint and say, well, we need to just not do that. We need to pull our mask down. We need to be authentically who we are, But the reality is that we are well aware of the risks that can come when we don't perform what is expected of us. And sometimes we need to do that for our own sense of safety or protection or for our child's, and that's okay. But what we can do is notice when it's happening and be curious about it. And this, I'm the same. If I'm around particular family members, I will notice that I will mother in a different way. Things that I previously didn't care about, I suddenly care about. If the iPad is on the table when we're eating a meal, oftentimes at home, not a big value for me. I don't really care that much, right? But if we're out at a restaurant or in a social setting, I might. Okay, so thinking about how our behavior can shape according to different contexts, not judging ourselves for that, noticing it, and then sometimes asking ourselves, where might it be helpful for me to loosen my grip on how things are meant to be here? Where could that be more helpful? Because what I've experienced is that sometimes when we're in that energy of performance and we're in that energy of being hypervigilant or aware of how we're being perceived or judged, that leads us and sets us up to try and exert more control over our children.
Yep.
And for many of our children, most, they will rebel and resist to us trying to control them because that's their fight for agency. Okay, so it can end up leading to quite a toxic power over dynamic with our children where we're trying to control them because on some level we're aware that we are being judged based on their behavior and how they're acting. And this is why it can be so stressful for so many of us in public scenarios, particularly with young children. And it's where mother blame comes in. So, these are really complex dynamics, Emily, and I'm conscious that, for listeners, this might be like really, it can feel really overwhelming at first if this is the first time you're listening to information framed in this way. And if that's the case, It's okay. Let it be. You don't have to do anything with this. You don't have to go and write out the list. You don't have to reflect on these questions. Just the fact that you've been listening to this conversation, trust that little bits and pieces and seeds will have been planted and bits will seep in where needed and will come back and return to you in time. And this is a process that is always ongoing for all of us.
Yeah, thank you for naming that for those who may start to feel a little anxious or overwhelmed. And yeah, I think for me, my own awareness, right, of that like performance piece, it's just another layer of internalizing this is my fault. Like I am doing this thing again. So I think you would probably like split that out to be like, and what would you say actually to that inner dialogue? That's more
Yeah, I
policing?
would go put on your social scientist glasses, like borrow them for me, like from me, right? So I literally think of it whenever I experience anything like this, I go, this is so interesting. What could this be telling me about motherhood in our society? Like, so what I'm talking about here is a little bit of distancing, to be able to, in some ways, compartmentalize it a little bit and go, like, let's get some curiosity about this. What could this mean? What could this be saying? And you have no responsibility to do anything with it. For some of us, holding on to I don't think anyone would probably have made it this far in the conversation listening if this were them. But for some people, they don't want to hear about the perfect mother myth. They don't want to hear about it. That is very strongly attached to their sense of self and identity. They're very comfortable in that, and they are not interested in shifting it or changing it. These conversations that we're having, these topics that we're exploring are not topics that are desired to be universally explored. It's a particular group of us that have been initiated into this level of curiosity about our experience because of largely our own lived experience or what we've witnessed. So allowing yourself the gift of that curiosity too, and knowing that there is no pressure on you to do anything with it, that all of this is ultimately with the purpose of creating a life that is your own and of being able to be in your mothering experience in a way that is rewarding and fulfilling and that creates space for you to exist as a person, not just as a role or as an archetype.
Yeah, right back to that vision you shared. What I am curious though, just in terms of like actions or things people could take from here. So I'm hearing from you very explicit, like you don't have to do anything at all. That's number one. Two, there's a layer of maybe doing some of that inner excavation and curiosity and noticing things in your life and just seeing them from a social lens, not just an individual lens. And then three, I'm curious, like, is there a layer of this that looks like, I feel like I want to circle up with other mothers in my community and like have conversations about this? Like, have you kind of found success in other mothers coming together to discuss and unpack this work together?
Yes, yeah. So on my website, I have a directory on there of certified motherhood studies practitioners, and that's all of the work that they do. So I think it is helpful to be able to connect in with somebody who can lead in this way. You can try and do it, but it can be a bit clunky, and you need to know there needs to be a gathering space with a level of intentionality that I think needs to be accompanied by an education piece. So even if this is a case of someone listening to this podcast episode and sending it to a friend and being like, hey, I found this really interesting. And then if the friend picks that up and would like to explore that, then that's something you might like to do together. But I think it can be helpful to have spaces, whether that be like a women's circle or spaces online, or even if you want to do like a counseling session with somebody who is aware and understanding of motherhood studies. I think that is useful because sometimes it can feel a little bit like we're at sea when we go down this path of exploration, and it actually is not something that exists in mainstream society as a conversation. So intentionally and consciously trying to seek out some spaces where you can have these conversations and build these connections can be really valuable.
And on that note, let's talk about some of the resources that you have available so folks who want to work with you more could find access to that. So obviously you have your website, but what are some of the ways that you like to support those who want to go deeper with this work?
Yeah, so I have some courses. Majority of the work that I do now is in training practitioners. So on the directory, people can go through, and there are heaps of incredible people like you, Emily, who are on there and who are doing work through courses, through community meetups, through all sorts of creative ways of exploring this work. I have a motherhood studies practitioner certification, so that's for people who want to get trained in this to go and offer that type of support to mothers. And I have my podcast, the Good Enough Mother podcast, where I have conversations similar to this, exploring these themes. And I have a social media as well, Instagram and Facebook, where I've got a bunch of posts that explore these ideas in different ways too.
Amazing. So maybe the last question to close us out, if we go back to that vision that you shared and really about mothers kind of finding their own agency and creating their own identities and narratives, like what do you think is possible for the world, not just mothers, if that were to happen?
Well, the professor that I referenced earlier, Sarah Ruddick, part of her thesis was actually looking at how maternal thinking, which is the practice of thinking that is developed through mothering, is connected to world peace and world order. So it's a really big question to answer, but a simplified way I think that I would respond to that is knowing that when we are talking about the care of mothers, we're talking about the care of humans now, yes, but generations moving forward. And we talk about, someone needs to hold the baby. The person who's holding the baby needs to be held. And we keep going back in that line of going, the people who are doing the holding of the mothers also need to be held. I think that if we had an investment on the well-being, the health, and the care of mothers, that it would completely transform society, because mothers and primary caregivers are instrumental in shaping the future generation of our world, of our children. And so whenever we have conversations publicly about the importance of childhood and the importance of education for our children, healthcare of our children, access and services for our children, I always think about those who are nurturing those children, those who are rocking their babies to sleep, those who are having conversations with their children and dealing with sibling dynamics, and who are having conversations, with their 10-year-old daughters about consent and their body and what it means to be a girl and a woman, and those who are creating space to allow their little boys to break down and cry, and redefining what it means to be a boy and to be strong and to be in touch with your body and your emotions. And all of the work that we do as mothers in a micro way impacts macro structures. And I think a lot of us are doing this work in resistance, but we wouldn't necessarily name it as that. But whenever we are mothering in a way that is aligned with our values of who we are and what we want to see in the world, that is a political act. That is an act of public service. And it's one that if we were to name and to support structurally, economically, and institutionally, would have ripple effects beyond what we would even be able to name and predict.
Yeah, it would birth a whole new world. And what a powerful way to end this conversation. So thank you so much for all that you've brought here today. And obviously, this is only the surface level of the depth of research and information and just perspective changing work that you're offering in the world. So thank you for who you are and what you're bringing forth. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for this conversation, Emily.
Take care. Hi, it's Emily again. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. If you want to go into a deeper dive with Sophie, head over to her website, drsophiebrock.com. There you can find out more about her current offers, including the Motherhood Study Certification, which is an amazing program. Again, I highly recommend it. I've been going through it myself. And another course called Building Your Mother Support Business. You can also follow along with Sophie on Instagram at Dr. Sophie Brock, or check out her podcast, The Good Enough Mother. Thank you so much for being a listener and a supporter of this show. Your support means the world because it's actually helping us to create new worlds. It's helping us to shape culture through the conversations that you're having. And the best way to support this platform is by sharing this platform. So if you subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, follow along on Instagram, share the content that is speaking to you. This is a way to start changing the cultural conversation through your relationships. Thank you again so much for listening. Take care.